What's up, dudes? Welcome back to the Cinehorde. This is the Donkey, and I'm the Gimp.
Yep.
This week we're doing something a little different. There are only going to be 2 pieces up on the blog because we're going to do a somewhat extended discussion of the 1922 film Nosferatu, which is best known as a piece of German expressionist film that takes the form of Gothic horror. It's funny because this film originally wanted to be a Dracula film, but they changed all the names of the characters in order to get around paying the Stoker estate.
Exactly.
But it didn't work. They got sued, and then the company that distributed the film went bankrupt. You just told me that today.
Yeah, so
That was funny.
my little trivia facts about it. Also, no one knows where Nosferatu comes from, the word itself.
Nosferatu.
Nosferatu. So yeah, think about that for a little bit.
Yeah. There are theories, but no one's been able to prove it.
So do you want to talk about the plot of this movie?
Have you guys seen any Dracula movies? It's that, I mean, except this one's a little different, right? Because, originally there's this Count Orlok dude who's, like, looking for a house, and then there's this, what was his name?
Hutter?
Hutter. I keep wanting to call him Hunter. Because Hutter is such a strange name.
Indeed.
But, he's a dude who wants to make money, so someone suggests to him, why don't you just offer this guy the house opposite of you?
Yeah.
Like, take him there, show him around, and you should be good. It should be quick and easy. And then he gets sucked into this sort of dark adventure. I consider this, like, in terms of film, there's a long tradition of Gothic horror in novels. But I consider this the progenitor of Gothic horror films because it establishes much of what becomes a trope for the vampire films that come later.
Exactly. Like you have the haunted castle, the deserted house. There's scenes with like these vast forests that imply danger.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have suspicious locals that Hutter encounters, and there's also a plague theme as well.
So what do all these symbols typically mean in Gothic horror anyway?
Typically they imply that
By the way, I know the answers.
they imply a time past, and there's a certain type of romanticism with it that people associate it with, which is what the Gothic movement was inspired by.
So I meant kind of specifically. Like, for example, one of the things that happens in Gothic horror, as opposed to old fairy tales, because we all know they're morality tales, and if you don't go back and read the Brothers Grimm versions that they collected, they were early anthropologists. At least that's what I consider them, early cultural anthropologists. But many of those stories are straight morality tales, and some of them are, like, gruesome and horrific, right?
Yeah.
So the biggest thing for those stories were about warning people of danger. And, like, don't go into the woods because the wolves will eat you. That's why you have the big bad wolf. Don't go, like, faking who you are, or otherwise you might end up mutilated, a la Cinderella's stepsisters. Right?
Yeah.
Things like that. So this very much stems from that kind of tradition, right?
Yeah.
How?
It does.
How?
Well, like the creepy old castle contains like a dangerous creature that feeds on people at night.
So, like, what's the difference between that and the standard fairy tale formula?
Well, actually, there is no difference. Some people actually look at Dracula as a much larger fairy tale. But it's because of those complex cultural symbols that were happening at the time. So you have like xenophobia, you have an innocent maiden. I mean, these are standard Gothic tropes. It's just the distinction between what the Brothers Grimm were recording and something like Dracula. The line becomes very thin if you think about it. It's just we created this structure, this Gothic structure that has informed it.
What I'm getting at though is what makes the Gothic horror, what makes Gothic horror different from what the Brothers Grimm recorded?
Well, there's not really a difference.
Okay, I'm just gonna jump in then. So typically, with Gothic horror, it's a little different in that most of the fear is centered outside, right? Whereas in the traditional fairy tale, much of the fear is centered in the unknown outside. Whereas in Gothic horror, there tends to be a little spot tucked away, and inside what is familiar, it's kind of nested and hidden. So there's this idea that the invader's already here. The danger is already there. You just don't know where it is. Whereas in traditional fairy tales, the danger is in the woods, the danger is in the next town over, the danger is somewhere farther away from you, and like you can look over there and know that. Whereas with Gothic horror, that's not so apparent. Although this particular film kind of straddles the line because, on the one hand, you do know that the Count is coming, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's a scene where the Nosferatu basically buries himself in a coffin and has his horses carry him onto a ship, and then the ship is boarded and it sails, and a bunch of rats come out of the coffin and they carry plague.
Yeah.
It's not quite explicitly said whether the vampire drained all the sailors that die on the ship or if the rats infected them with the Black Plague. In fact, I don't think it matters because he's referred to as the Death Bird throughout the movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are some distinguishing characteristics between the two. They're not exactly the same. The modes are slightly different.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things I found in this film is what would later... You know how in later vampire films, like even later interpretations of Dracula, they're far more sexual, like overtly?
Yeah.
There seems to be like this idea that the darkness calls to the maiden, right? The darkness within Nosferatu and in the night calls to the maiden because she has a premonitory vision that arguably never comes true. Arguably. But other people do experience what she sees. And like when Dracula...
Yeah, the Count.
Oops. I apparently owe the Stoker estate some money. She's like, he's here, I must go to him. She could have been talking about her husband, or she could have been talking about the creature.
Yeah.
I think she was talking about the creature. Like, she kind of feels compelled. And that can easily be read as a 1922 version of animalistic, sensual desire, right?
Yeah.
Because that wasn't something you could express in movies back then.
No, not really.
Like, at all.
Yeah.
Like, that was kind of a no-no.
Well, also, like, Germany at the time, so stuff like that would be really transgressive, and I think this film explores it pretty well, and especially, like, towards the end,
Yeah.
where he's feeding on the girl.
Oh, yeah, that thing about... So he has to... In this movie, he has to feast on a maiden without sin so that he can forget that the sun is rising and be killed.
Yeah, there were a couple little plot things in this movie where I noticed that it was just like, why does that work, or why did that happen?
Right, so the funny thing, right, is the whole idea behind the vampire and the blood-sucking comes from a couple of different things. One is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, well, more prominently in Judaism, it used to be a religion of blood sacrifice, but you could only sacrifice certain animals or whatever else. at the altars, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you spilled any of that blood, it was considered bad for you, because blood to the Hebrews at the time was very strongly equated with the notion of like basically life juice, right? So this dude's basically taking your life juice and using it to sustain himself.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes the vampire so horrific from that vantage point. I forgot what I was going to say the other thing was. I'm running on like a sleep. My bad, dudes.
Oh, it's fine. One of the things I was going to mention is that the lighting in this film is pretty awesome, especially when you see Count Orlok coming out of the shadows, and you see, like, the different lights and how they hit his face.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it all implies, like, he's this other creature that is everything we fear.
A creature of the shadow, basically. Like, that's accentuated. You might actually call it, like, stylistically speaking, like visuals, you could call it like the proto-noir style, which is what some film scholars consider German Expressionism.
Yeah.
Which this is a part of that whole movement.
Yep.
It's much more interesting to look at Nosferatu as part of the German Expressionist movement as opposed to just a straight Gothic film, in my opinion.
No, agreed. It uses those Gothic tropes in order to tell something that's universal in human nature.
And the funny thing, okay, so I started thinking about religious symbolism in this movie because it's kind of hard to get away from. There's a lot of it in the movie if you're looking at the shots, because it's a silent film, dudes.
Yeah.
It's a silent film. You're not getting no dialogue. But, so when I started thinking about religious symbolism, I started thinking about when the plague hit Rome.
Yep.
Right? There was a plague of rats that brought fleas and bit people, and people were dying. People attributed it, as they typically do, which is another thing that is common in Gothic horror, is that there's a connection between an event that we know, i.e. now we know that fleas carry the Black Plague,
Yep.
right? And then reaching back in history, like you could also ascribe it to a supernatural cause. So when the plague hit Rome, you had fanatical Jeebus cults who would flagellate themselves in order to try to purge themselves and other people of sin, because they thought that that would make the plague go away.
Same in the Black Death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there were people doing it again in Europe, like after the Roman Empire too, you're right.
Yeah.
And that's something you see all over the place, and symbols of that can be felt throughout this entire movie. Like, there's this scene of people just carrying coffins down the street.
Yeah, and people a crowd gets worked up into a frenzy trying to chase this one dude named Knock.
Yeah.
Who's the Redfield of this film.
It's implied somewhat that maybe he had already encountered the Nosferatu, or he's just a fanatic. You could read it either way.
Yeah, because in the beginning he's reading these occult symbols.
Yeah.
That if you don't know anything about the symbolism, it's like, is he communicating with something, or...
Honestly, I just noticed it was astrological chart notation.
Yeah, but you know...
Yeah.
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 But yeah, I just call him like a Crowley person.
Yeah, he's a Crowley-ish type person. I'm trying to think what else I should say about this film. Dudes, my brain is struggling. I think I need more sleep.
I have a question though. How is this compared to like other vampire films? Because it's something I'm always interested to see how it stacks up.
So you know how earlier I talked about vampire films becoming more sexualized?
Yeah.
So Nosferatu is ugly as hell.
Yep.
So here's the thing, right? Later, the vampire becomes beautiful, seductive, right? But Nosferatu has kind of a raw charisma that's rooted in his shadow nature, because he is all that humans fear and hate and loathe and want to keep away from them. And there's a kind of power in that, and you see that in the movie. But it's obvious that he's a creature of darkness throughout. Whereas later on in vampire lore, and I'm not going to include Twilight because
Yeah.
it's Twilight. But that aspect, that physical aspect, becomes concealed and they become beautiful so that they can draw you in.
Yep.
And it's not until you're too close to get away that you start seeing the dark part of the creature, right?
Right.
You start realizing they're not human, they're creatures.
Mm-hmm.
They're creatures that want to feed. And I think that, to me, this is my reading of vampire fiction in general, and movies in particular, is that it's more of an allegory for the two opposing sides of human nature that we see in ourselves,
Yeah.
right? Like, on the one hand, many of us appear normal, or we think we do, we often don't.
Yeah.
Because normal's subjective based on other people's points of view of us.
Right.
But there's also this a shit ton of repressed desires that we never express. And I think that more modern vampire movies explore that a little more deeply rather than making it so obvious.
Yeah. Yep, you hit the nail on the head.
This is more like there's a lot of xenophobia in this movie, like you already mentioned. And that aspect of it, from what I recall, is true to the spirit of Bram Stoker's novel.
Yeah.
Because it was very much about what is foreign coming to take what you think belongs to you and your country.
Yep.
And if that still sounds relevant today, you might be awake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not just an old vampire tale that was written ages ago to appease, young readers' sensibilities.
What are some of your favorite things to tell people about this movie?
One of my favorite things to tell people about is I just like the setting and the lighting, and Count Orlok is pretty menacing if you really think about it. I mean, it can look a little ridiculous at times, but if you put yourself in the mindset of an audience that was watching this film at the time, it looks creepy. And the actor who portrayed him was a very tall man at the time.
He was imposing compared to the rest of the people.
He was almost like Christopher Lee height.
You know what's weird, though? They use the camera in such a way that makes him actually look more diminutive.
Yeah, I remember that.
Which is a strange choice, right? Because if I were making a scary movie, dude, I would want to make this dude look as massive as I could. And with a guy like that, you don't have to try very hard.
Yeah.
Because, man, I saw pictures of him outside of makeup and with, like, no camera trickery.
Mm-hmm.
And the dude is something just short of a giant.
Yeah.
He's a really imposing guy.
Yeah.
But he looks nothing like Nosferatu, right? Like, but
I don't think so.
I would want to accentuate that.
Yeah, and the actors and their expressions are really well done.
For people that would comment that it seems overacted, right? Because I have heard that.
Yeah.
And that's modern people reading their own expectations onto an older film. What we have to remember is that in the silent film era, and even in the early era of talkies, as they used to be called, some people would call them soundies. I don't know why. That's kind of dumber. I think talkies is weird too. But in these early eras, stage actors were doubling as film actors.
Yeah.
So when you act for the stage, you need people to be able to recognize your emotion from rows and rows back, even in the cheap seats, like the nosebleeds, right? So everything is going to be exaggerated. Everything.
Yeah, and that's what I meant by, like, putting yourself in that mindset.
Yeah.
And it's funny because Count Orlok's expressions are more muted, but there's still like an aura of
there's like this
creepiness.
constant menacing look beneath every other expression.
Yeah, and I think it still holds up today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what I would mention to people.
So I should mention this up front. In a few months, I was thinking about, like, cutting out all the dialogue plates in the film and adding our own parody dialogue plates. Since the film is in the public domain, it's probably going to be crude, but it'll be funny to me, and I'll probably upload it so you guys can look at it.
Yeah.
Hopefully some of you enjoy it. Probably almost none of you will. It's fine. I have a very specific kind of humor to me.
Yeah.
But I'm doing it for me, not for you.
Yeah.
It'll be fun. And yeah.
Anything else you want to say about this classic?
I just want to say I had to read an essay on American Gothic horror prior to watching this film, and it was almost wholly irrelevant. So if you guys are film students, my recommendation is watch the movie first, and if you have to read anything that's supposed to be associated with it, forget it.
Yeah.
Just analyze the film for yourself using what you know, and your experience of the film will be much richer, because I have to say, reading that essay kind of ruined my viewing of it, because I thought the essay was pedantic and trite. I'll probably leave a link to the boring essay in the description. Maybe some of you will like it.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I really don't have anything else to say.
Yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Alright, well, I guess this has been Most Tired Captain Gimpy, and this has been the Zenburo that needs to go to work soon.
Yeah.
And we'll see you at the movies.
Yep.
Alright.